Hopefully you found that video looking at different challenges faced by Nepal in adapting to a changing climate, as well as if you stayed on for the shorter Bangladeshi examples. I think it gave a nice background about areas in which too much water could be an issue, not enough water could be an issue, and the challenges that individuals at an individual level face when trying to deal with these issues. I wanted to base this this ultimate section of the penultimate class of the semester based around this reading that we had for this week, because I think it ties in quite nicely the general theoretical models that we've looked at in this class, as well as micro level creative research designs at the local level. And the takeaway, as we've seen from this article from The Economist and other press reports and research over previous weeks, that often those that are the hardest hit by these shifting characteristics of states and their resources and the resource base and their ability to respond to these changes are often the least able to afford to it. And it's these developing countries, ones that don't have the capacity as developed states, that are often the most vulnerable, that face the highest risks of these kind of changes, and the pressures to could be less of an issue to mitigate, because a lot of these countries don't generate that much CO2 emissions. It's more about trying to adapt to the changes caused by people from other parts of the world, often the developing countries. A couple of brief points for those of you who might not be familiar with recent Nepali history. Really fascinating, again, my interest in mountaineering and the great game relationship between Britain and France in the 19th century and the early not Britain and France, the Britain and Russia in the 19th century, and the pressures in Tibet and Nepal to open, trying to resist those pressures and interference from abroad is really fascinating. And the early efforts to try to explore the region was from the north, because it was easier to do so there than to try to get access to this area that was closed to outsiders until 1951. So the end of the actually it was closer to 53, because the British only received permission to be able to climb at the last minute in 53. So the end of hereditary rule of the Rania chief ministers was one of those other changes that happened in the aftermath of World War II. First democratic elections in 1991, the Congress Party won. There was a Maoist revolt against the hierarchy, the monarchy, in 1995, really got started in 1996. The conflict lasted until 2006, in which estimates range from 10 to 15,000 people died during the conflict. The royal family was killed in a palace massacre by one of the royal sons that ended up killing the king. There was an end to the monarchy as part of the peace deal in 2006. There was an election in 2008 to form what would be the Constituent Assembly to pass a constitution that would lead to a permanent legislature in 2008. There was a lot of worry about political violence in the aftermath of the Civil War that had ended less than 2 years earlier. There was low-level forms of political violence in 2008 and in subsequent elections, but nothing like the recurrence of anything that you saw during the Civil War period. So the Maoists fought the central government, often typified by by those like the Congress Party. After the end of the conflict, there was the vote. The Maoists won that vote. However, they left shortly afterward in 2009. 2013, next election, the Congress Party won it without a clear majority. Then there was the earthquake in 2015 that caused widespread devastation, as we're going to see in a second. Shortly afterwards, kind of like with the Aceh case, natural disaster can be a way to try to to move beyond certain issues to be able to deal with others. There was a new constitution passed, 7 years after that initial Constituent Assembly. It was really tough to be able to pass a new constitution. As we've seen in this class with the importance of political institutions, when things are changing, when there's an opportunity for negotiation or advantage, people have a lot of incentive to try to push hard to be able to seek benefits from it. After the Constitution passed, there was elections in 2015. There was a coalition government, and the Maoists pulled out. A little less than a year later, there was another election. Maoist leader Prachanda, who was the rebel leader of the Maoists during the war, was reelected as prime minister for the second time. First time was right after the Constituent Assembly elections. This kind of shows the concentration of the earthquake damage from the United Nations. They have a lot of really great maps showing evolution of political violence over time, and they also have ones looking at natural disasters. You see the different provinces within the country, and you see the heavy damage right there in the Kathmandu Valley, as well as in neighboring areas. This area is also subject to other types of disasters, as we saw with the video, with flooding, landslides. You see areas that are most affected are the ones that are more in the low-lying areas down towards the southern part of the country, as well as some of the hill areas and mountain areas as well. This article that I signed, I think, was really interesting, an explicitly different take than a lot of the other articles that we've read in this class so far. You see the area in the country in which they focused on for their hands-on research in the Midwestern region. It is pretty far away from Kathmandu and takes a while to get to, and looking at areas in which you have a different kind of context than you often see in the capital city. They have these three areas. They provide background about how large the population base is, the political context, economic context, and the security context. And I think this is really interesting for the way that we kind of think about these issues. Often you just look at country level averages or country level trends of national parties. However, there's a lot of really important variation in the political strength and involvement of political parties, and there's been a lot of differences in the Nepali case between what national level leaders say and what the local level leaders actually have to deal with. They create something that should look familiar to us as a conceptual mapping or framework similar to a path diagram that we've seen in other articles, and they conceptualize human security and these components of resilience in a way that's similar, hopefully, to what we remember from the human security discussion in the first part of the class. But they include people's livelihoods, provision of justice, security, well-being, equity, and governance as part of that overall construction of resilience. That some of these require more resources than others. They don't really differentiate between these different things, and I think for me, when looking at it with a multifaceted kind of outcome, how do you prioritize if you're focusing on governmental projects, or if you're the World Bank trying to decide what to fund? Do you focus on people's livelihoods, justice, security? You can connect it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and focus on basics like security or securing people's livelihoods, and then focus on things like justice and governance later on. But different people can prioritize these different issues in different ways. So the environment and climate change challenges these elements of human security and people's resilience to allow them to be able to survive those change. That can lead through a process of either having good governance and strong institutions, or bad governance, to having either a positive peace. When you have good governance, you have people satisfied with with the provision of services and less of grievances against the state, the opposite would be effect, right, with poor governance and with poor policies, and that could lead to the kind of violence that the country experienced before 2006. How does the government adapt to these kind of measures? They looked at a couple of different projects as ways to adapt to climate change in those three specific regions that they looked at. One they really kind of are critical of was the provision of rice in certain areas that didn't normally depend on rice as a food staple, that it was seen as a relative resource for people who are well off, and that once the projects ended, that there wouldn't be a self-sustaining means of providing those kind of resources. Others reduce poverty or disaster, and you can see these kind of complex path diagrams that don't necessarily have a clear kind of flow like the cycle model in the beginning of today or the Homer-Dixon path diagrams you've seen over the course of the semester. But I think in each one of these you could make your own argument or focus on one specific aspect to see how these disaster compensation mechanisms could help provide adaptive capacity to different people with these economic resources that could have an effect on follow-on migration and whatever. So you have different elements of resilience that should hopefully seem pretty familiar to us in our provisions of human security, as well as government adaptive efforts that can have an effect on climate change resilience and adaptation, but also should seem similar to our existing efforts at trying to reduce poverty through the Sustainable Development Goals or others that we've seen over the course of the semester. So you can have these projects domestically or internationally, as we're going to see next week, that can be focused on providing a good, and that can help them across a wide swath of different challenges, provide resilience to both climate insecurity or pandemic unemployment that we've seen over the last couple months. So a lot of these projects have multifaceted impacts, and that can protect them against a number of different challenges. However, there can be overlap or competing interests in the providing these efforts that can be that can work against each other, and that's why I think this article echoes what we've seen with Operation Lifeline Sudan and with complex emergencies in previous weeks, that when you have multiple actors all doing competing things, it can create inefficiencies, right? So California's cap and trade system or carbon taxes increase uncertainty and compliance costs for businesses who operate in California as well as in other parts of the U.S. And so that's why there have been business groups that are actually pushing for federal level policies to reduce uncertainty and make it consistent across the U.S. But to date, that hasn't happened. And when Nepal, you see the reliance on the kind of international efforts at providing resources for adaptive capacity, but often they can be ideally shaped by the local conditions, right? That's what this article was calling for, saying that you need to actually do the observation and assessment that we've talked about to understand the specific needs of a specific area. And that would increase effect and see what already is being done in the area. And that should be more likely to be effective than just trying to impose a blanket approach if you're a national government on all parts of the country. So local conditions, observation and assessment, and a coordinated response, the takeaway from the literature, should lead to increasing capacity to either mitigate actions or adapt to them. But of course, it all depends on resources, coordination, and figuring out what the actual needs are. Couple of last things. The article mentions Nepal's climate change support program. It was a Nepali national level effort at trying to provide resources for adapting to the challenges we saw in the video. Started back in 2010 with the policy passed in 2011. It was created with a lot of international funding, as with a lot of projects you'll see in Nepal. 80% of the money was spent aimed at spending on local level activities, 20% for institutional capacity building and coordinating at the national level. So this was a coordinated effort to address those critiques from the articles from the article we read, as well as others, that you need to tailor the programs to the subnational level, right? Something that's going to apply to Tasmania might not be appropriate for Northern Territories or Western Australia. So looking at local level activities, 100 different local adaptation plans of action were developed and are being implemented in 14 different districts. Gender equality was sought in both participants and management. I think it's really fascinating in the Nepali case, the way that gender has become salient in policymaking and in institutions. There is gender requirements in the new constitution for electing people to parliament, and in a lot of these expenditures towards development, poverty reduction, that's not necessarily related to climate. There's often a recognized gender component, part of which would be driven domestically, but then also the international aid organizations have their own agendas and best practices that they wanted to move forward. The last one was a recognition of class differences in an area that has similar caste systems in certain parts of the country to India to the south. So 50% of the participants would be from Dalit or other disadvantaged communities. The different categories for adaptation, I couldn't find a better version of this pie graph. I guess I can kind of make it on my own. So I honestly can't tell which ones are actually relatively weighted, so I can just treat all of them as salient categories that were mentioned in their adaptation program. Agriculture, food security, livelihoods, elements we've already touched on already, the importance of today, forest and biodiversity, something that for those of you who might come from the environment background have more training in, but that hasn't been as mentioned as much in the political adaptation literature. Capacity development through developing of skills, income planning to recognize climate-induced hazards. Education, I mentioned earlier, is an important driver for a whole host of adaptive capacity and building resilience. Some of the spending there reflects that. Water resources and alternative energies. In certain part of the country, there's too much. Other parts of the country, not enough. So water resource management would, of course, have to depend on the local needs. And infrastructure development. I've been amazed in my visits in Nepal, going over a couple of decades, the amount of infrastructure that's been created in a relatively short period of time in some of the toughest terrain anywhere, but then also the challenges that remain for a country that doesn't have like Australia's budget to be able to build the infrastructure to extend and to provide services throughout the country is still relatively limited. I remember in one of the recent elections, in order to get the ballots back for national level counting, they actually had to bring the ballots in by helicopter. They didn't have the time or the capacity to get it to the central counting areas any other way. So different categories depending on the different needs identified in the different parts of the country. I've been talking a lot. That was kind of a few things about the Nepali case. A couple of general conclusions from today. This class on the domestic responses. We only have the one more class on the international responses, which is always one I really enjoy. You're almost there, almost done. Today's motivating question was basically, how are national and subnational governments trying to mitigate or adapt to the challenges that we've seen so far, focused more on the climate change issues. Human security, of course, crops up there, often because of how the climate change affects those human security issues for being able to provide a livelihood, just basic human survival, political or civil rights as well. I defined our terms, mitigation, adaptation, and risk, and applied it, or seen how it was applied in a couple of different cases. It's important, as for your papers as well, to kind of decide who are the relevant actors we really want to talk about. The Nepali case, Nepali article, talked about the importance of really local level factors and individuals and needs. Others, like the Australian case and report, kind of talk about the country as a whole. The U.S., there's a lot of different efforts through cap and trade and other subnational actors. So being clear about who's doing what to mitigate or adapt. The national level is where you usually see the coordination either exist or not exist, or where the weaknesses arise. Developing countries still have to face at least as great, if not greater, challenges than developed countries. And developed countries have used a bunch of different mechanisms. Some have been adopted by developing countries as well through either cap and trade or taxations to try to use different ways of trying to mitigate the kind of greenhouse gas production that we've seen. Adaptation often involves security concerns. The ADF is worried about migration from low-lying areas in the Pacific, something the U.S. is also worried about as well. Often adaptation structures focus on national security and then on the kind of capacity and human security issues that the Nepali reading talks about. And these developing countries that the Nepali reading focuses on highlights the fact that these areas have higher risks, right? The costs of these changes happening and the probability of them happening are higher than a lot of the developing countries where they don't have the capacity to be able to respond and provide that resilience and reduce vulnerability that we kind of enjoy here. So it's a lot. It's our first effort at trying to look at how countries respond to the risk factors we have identified in the previous 10 weeks. And in week 12, we pull the focus back even further to look at multilateral efforts to address environmental security challenges, human security challenges, and conflict challenges. So I look forward to that. I hope you enjoy the workshop, and I'll see you one last time next week.